The echo and the vault. They built a fortress in the sky to keep the world out. But they never asked what happens when the monster is already inside. How does a man die inside a room that cannot be opened from the outside? The question wasn't a philosophical koan. It was a jagged piece of reality lodged in the throat of Viridian City's most impenetrable fortress. A shard of impossibility that defied the cold, hard logic of steel and code. Detective Kalen Vance felt its sharp edges pressing against his own skepticism as he stood in the center of Julian Croft's penthouse. A sterile cathedral of glass and chrome perched 47 floors above the sprawling, breathing chaos of the city he knew. The official narrative, the one his captain was already impatiently demanding through a series of terse, one-word texts, was being neatly packaged by the forensics team. No forced entry. No signs of a struggle. A single, devastating wound from a custom-made Kessler-Voss pistol. A marvel of German engineering so precise it seemed an extension of the cold, calculating mind that had conceived the room around it. The weapon lay near Croft's outstretched hand, its polished surfaces catching the intrusive morning light in a way that felt staged, almost insultingly artistic. The initial verdict, the one everyone from the mayor's office to the board of directors desperately wanted, was suicide. A tragic, but ultimately simple end for a man whose life was a monument to unbearable complexity. But Vance's gut, a notoriously unreliable organ according to his ex-wife, but the most trusted tool in his professional arsenal, was churning with a familiar, acidic dissent. He'd seen suicides. He'd smelled the cloying film of sweat, despair, and finality they left behind, a scent that clung to the air long after the body was gone. This room, however, smelled only of the faint ozone from the humming server racks hidden behind a pane of smoked glass, the chemical tang of industrial-grade air purifiers, and the ghost of expensive Italian leather from the minimalist furniture. It was the smell of absolute, suffocating control, not its catastrophic loss. Vance, a man whose rumpled suit and scuffed shoes were a silent protest against the very idea of sterile perfection, began his slow, deliberate orbit of the scene. The door was a masterpiece of modern paranoia. A seamless slab of titanium alloy that slid silently into the wall, secured by a dual authentication system that required not just Croft's thumbprint but a live, vascular scan of his retina. The system logs, already triple-checked by Croft's own shell-shocked security chief, a man who looked as if he'd aged a decade in the last 3 hours, were presented as immutable digital scripture. The door was sealed from the inside at 11:42 p.m. It was manually overridden by a 3-person executive failsafe protocol at 8:15 a.m. In the intervening 8 hours and 33 minutes, the penthouse was a hermetically sealed vault, a time capsule. The windows, vast panes of armored, non-opening glass, offered a god's-eye view of the city but were fused to their frames, immovable barriers against the outside world. The ventilation system was a completely closed loop, its intake and outtake vents smaller than a fist and protected by a web of laser grids and pressure sensors. Nothing came in. Nothing went out. Yet here lay Julian Croft, the architect of this digital panopticon, his life's work ironically serving as his own opulent tomb. Vance crouched, his knees issuing a familiar, creaking protest beside the body. He tuned out the precise, clipped tones of a young forensics tech cataloging the scene, her face illuminated by the cold glow of a datapad. He looked at Croft's face. The skin was waxy, but the expression was what held him. The eyes were wide, not with the vacant, unfocused stare of death, but with a specific, frozen terror. They were fixed, not on the ceiling or the gun, but on a point in the empty space just before the vast window, as if he were the sole audience to an impossible, terrifying spectacle. This wasn't the face of a man turning a weapon on himself. It was the face of a man who had just witnessed something that fundamentally broke his rigid, ordered understanding of the world. Vance's gaze drifted from the body to the room's immaculate, almost painful order. A collection of rare first-edition physics textbooks, Heisenberg, Bohr, Schrödinger, stood perfectly aligned on a floating shelf. A single stark painting, a chaotic, violent splash of black on a vast white canvas, hung on the far wall, the only hint of disorder, and even that was intentional. Everything was curated, a reflection of the mind that had conceived it. But perfection is a lie. Vance had built his entire career on that simple, profound truth. He'd learned to look for the single, misplaced thread that, when pulled, unravels the entire, carefully woven tapestry. He saw it then. Not a clue in the traditional sense, not a piece of evidence that could be bagged and tagged, but an anomaly. On a low-slung table of polished obsidian, a surface so flawless it mirrored the clouds drifting by outside, sat a single, half-empty glass of water. There was no coaster beneath it. A faint, almost invisible ring of condensation had formed and evaporated, leaving a ghostly watermark on the perfect blackness. Julian Croft, a man who had once fired a senior vice president on the spot for leaving a coffee mug stain on a quarterly report, a man whose entire existence was a fanatical crusade against human messiness and imperfection, would never, under any circumstances, have left a glass on that table without a coaster. It was a detail so small, so profoundly trivial, it was meaningless. And in a room built on the very premise of absolute meaning and order, the meaningless was the only thing that mattered. It was the whisper of a second person, a ghost in the machine, a presence that the logs, the sensors, and the entire billion-dollar security system had somehow missed. The pressure from downtown was to close the case, to label it a tragedy and allow the city's tech messiah to be mourned without the stain of a messy, unsolved crime. But Kalen Vance wasn't interested in the city's narrative. He was listening to the echo in the vault, and it was just beginning to speak. Vance spent the next 48 hours submerged in the digital ghost of Julian Croft, a man who had meticulously curated his life into a fortress of data so vast and complex it felt like a parallel universe. He sat in his cluttered, paper-strewn office, a chaotic sanctuary that stood as a defiant antithesis to the minimalist perfection of the crime scene. The glow of his monitor painted his tired face in shifting shades of blue and white as he navigated terabytes of encrypted files. A digital archaeologist digging through the ruins of a fallen king. The official case was closed. The coroner, a good man who knew which way the political winds blew, had signed off on the suicide ruling, adding a speculative but officially sanctioned note about acute psychological distress brought on by extreme professional pressures. The captain had clapped Vance on the shoulder with a heavy, final thud, told him good work, Kalen, and promptly reassigned him to a string of armed robberies in the industrial district. The city wanted to move on, but for Vance, the case had just cracked open. The watermark on the obsidian table was his anchor, a tiny, stubborn point of irrationality in a world built on cold, hard logic. He started with the apartment's architectural and engineering schematics, blueprints so dense with technical specifications they looked more like the nervous system of some alien leviathan. He cross-referenced them with the building's maintenance logs, searching for a forgotten service duct, a hidden panel, a construction oversight from a disgruntled contractor. Nothing. The penthouse was built exactly as designed. A seamless, impenetrable box suspended in the sky, a monument to one man's fear of the world. He moved on to Croft's human network, re-interviewing the 3 executives who held the failsafe override codes. They were all cut from the same expensive cloth. Sharp, ambitious, impeccably dressed, and radiating a palpable fear that their proximity to the event might tarnish their careers. They spoke of Croft with a bizarre mixture of slavish reverence and deep-seated terror, describing a genius who was brilliant, impossibly demanding, and in the last few years, increasingly isolated. They painted a picture of a man who trusted his own systems more than any human being. A man who saw people not as partners or colleagues, but as flawed, unpredictable variables to be managed and, if necessary, eliminated. One of them, a woman named Alani Reyes, the sharp-eyed head of research and development, hesitated when Vance pressed her about Croft's personal life, about enemies he might have made on his meteoric rise. She fiddled with a stylus, her gaze dropping to the table, before mentioning a name, a ghost from Croft's past he had tried to systematically erase from his own digital footprint, Dr. Eris Thorne. The name hit a dead end in every conventional database. Thorne was a theoretical physicist, a former university colleague and business partner from Croft's early pre-billionaire days. He had co-authored the foundational papers on the quantum state processors that had become the bedrock of Croft's entire empire. But while Croft had ascended to become a global icon, Thorne had simply vanished. There was no public record of him for the past 12 years. No social media presence, no credit score, no driver's license, no tax returns. He was a digital phantom, a man who had been expertly deleted from the modern world. Vance's instincts, dormant for 2 days, flared to life. He started digging deeper, bypassing official channels and calling in favors from old contacts in federal agencies who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. He finally unearthed a series of sealed civil court documents from over a decade ago. Thorne hadn't just vanished. He had been professionally and personally annihilated. A vicious, protracted patent dispute, initiated by Croft, had systematically stripped Thorne of his intellectual property rights and left him bankrupt. A concurrent, anonymous smear campaign, alleging academic fraud and plagiarism. Accusations later proven to be baseless but devastatingly effective at the time, had seen him ostracized from the scientific community he loved. Croft hadn't just beaten his partner in court. He had systematically, and with surgical precision, deleted him from existence. The search for Eris Thorne became a quiet obsession. Vance felt like he was chasing a whisper. A man who existed only in the negative space of Julian Croft's meticulously constructed life. He finally found a lead in the most analog of places. A dusty property tax record for a remote, off-grid cabin in the Cascade Mountains. A small plot of land owned by a defunct holding company that traced back, 3 steps removed, to Thorne's late mother. While the city's news cycles buzzed with saccharine tributes to Croft's genius, Vance drove for 6 hours, leaving the concrete and glass of Viridian City behind for the dense, silent, and indifferent forests of the north. The cabin was little more than a dilapidated shack, barely visible from the overgrown dirt track that served as a road. Inside he found Eris Thorne. He was gaunt, with a wild, unkempt beard and eyes that burned with an intensity that was both brilliant and profoundly unsettling. The cabin was a chaotic mess of textbooks, complex equations scrawled on every available surface, and strange, jury-rigged electronic devices that hummed with a low, resonant frequency. In the center of the room, on a large workbench, was a device that made the hair on Vance's arm stand up. It was a complex array of copper coils, superconducting magnets, and a central containment chamber that pulsed with a faint, violet light. It looked like something out of a forgotten pulp science fiction novel. Thorne wasn't surprised to see him. He spoke calmly, with the detached, serene air of a man who had long since disconnected from the world and its rules. He explained his work, using terms that Vance, a man who still struggled with his smartphone's privacy settings, could barely comprehend: quantum entanglement, spatial folding, localized wave function collapse. He claimed he hadn't broken into Croft's penthouse. He hadn't needed to. He had simply arrived. He described how he had spent the last 12 years of his exile perfecting a technology that could, for a fraction of a second, fold the fabric of space-time, allowing for instantaneous translocation between 2 pre-established points. He had built a small, corresponding receiver years ago, during the penthouse's construction, and hidden it behind a wall panel in Croft's study, a final, secret act of defiance against the man who took everything from him. He had used it only once. He had appeared in the middle of the room, a ghost made of flesh and blood. He hadn't brought a weapon. He hadn't said a word. He had simply stood there, a living, breathing paradox, a testament to the man Croft had tried to erase. The shock of seeing the impossible, Thorne explained with no discernible emotion, must have been too much for Julian's notoriously weak heart. He had watched as his old partner clutched his chest, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, and collapsed to the floor. Then, Eris Thorne had simply vanished, folding space back to his cabin in the woods, leaving behind nothing but a dead man, a locked room, and a faint ring of condensation from a glass of water he had poured himself while he waited for the inevitable. Vance stood in the humming silence of the cabin, the scent of pine and ozone filling his lungs. Before him stood a man who had confessed to a crime that was, by every legal and physical definition, impossible. There was no murder weapon, no physical evidence of his presence, no digital footprint. Eris Thorne hadn't broken any laws of man. He had broken the laws of physics. Taking him in would be a farce. The story would be torn apart by the media, laughed out of a courtroom, and Vance would be relegated to a desk job in the archives for the rest of his career. His captain's words echoed in his mind. "Good work, Kalen. The case is closed." And in that moment, Vance understood. The system he served wasn't designed to comprehend a truth like this. It was built on a foundation of predictable, tangible reality: fingerprints, ballistics, eyewitnesses. Thorne's confession was a ghost story, a piece of science fiction that had bled into the real world. To pursue it would be to chase a phantom down a rabbit hole, dragging the entire department with him into ridicule. He looked at Thorne, a man hollowed out by injustice but not broken by it. He had sought not revenge, but a form of cosmic balance. He hadn't killed Julian Croft. He had simply presented him with a truth his mind couldn't handle: that for all his wealth and power, for all his walls and firewalls, he could not delete a man from existence. He could not control everything. Vance thought of the perfect, sterile penthouse and the faint, ghostly watermark on the obsidian table. It was the only piece of evidence that mattered, and it was evidence of nothing and everything all at once. He made a decision. It wasn't about the law, or justice, or even the truth in its purest form. It was about closing a circle. He turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving Eris Thorne with his impossible machines and his quiet solitude. He never looked back. He drove the 6 hours back to Viridian City, the dense forest giving way to suburbs and then to the towering glass skyline. He filed his final report, a supplemental addendum that was deliberately vague. It noted that all leads had been exhausted, and that the initial ruling of suicide, while leaving some minor questions unanswered, remained the most plausible conclusion. He buried the ghost of Eris Thorne in a locked file in the back of his bottom desk drawer. A story for no one but himself. Months later, Vance found himself standing on a street corner, looking up at the Viridian Tower. The lights in the penthouse were dark. The company had been broken up and sold for parts, its impenetrable security systems now obsolete curiosities. The world had moved on, just as his captain had wanted. But Vance knew the truth. He knew that in a world racing to build bigger walls and more complex systems, the most dangerous threat isn't the one trying to break in. It's the ghost you created, the one you thought you had erased, returning to show you that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The case was closed, not because the system had won, but because he had understood its limits. He had let the impossible remain impossible, and in doing so, had found his own quiet, personal justice. He turned his back on the tower and walked away, disappearing into the anonymous, messy, beautifully imperfect crowds of the city below.